What if the image you've always seen of your favorite star wasn't the whole truth? What if the polished interviews, the glamorous performances, and the picture-perfect headlines were only half the story, hiding behind them a reality far darker, more complicated, and infinitely more human? Fame has a way of turning people into symbols, stripping them of their flaws, until the world sees only what it wants to see: the rebel, the genius, the hero, or the villain. But beneath those labels lies a person who has stumbled, fought, hidden secrets, and made decisions that even their most loyal fans would struggle to understand. That's where this story begins, not with the image carefully sold to the public, but with the contradictions and chaos that reveal who they really were. Because every star has a shadow, and sometimes that shadow tells the most revealing story of all. From the earliest days, whispers followed them, stories of ambition that bordered on obsession, of friendships broken in the pursuit of success, of a hunger for recognition that couldn't be satisfied even with fame. And as they rose, so did the rumors, shocking feuds, betrayals within their inner circle, controversies that seemed to emerge just as fast as the hit songs. Some called it bad luck, others claimed it was all part of their design. But whether by accident or intention, the scandals only fueled the obsession around them. Fans wanted to know every detail, every rumor, every speculation, and while critics lined up to tear them down, the world couldn't look away. The story you're about to hear is not just about music or fame, it's about the untold battles, the shocking revelations, and the moments the cameras didn't capture. It's about how someone can rise higher than anyone imagined, only to find that the fall is faster, harder, and far more public than they ever expected. And as we unravel their journey, one question will echo louder than the rest. Was this star a genius undone by the weight of fame, or a flawed human being whose mistakes became too big to ignore? Every legend begins somewhere, and for this artist, the beginning was far removed from the glamour and chaos that would later define their life. They weren't born into privilege, nor were they handed the keys to success. Instead, their story started in a modest home, surrounded by circumstances that could have easily swallowed their dreams before they ever had a chance to take flight. The neighborhood they grew up in wasn't the kind of place where opportunities were waiting at every corner. It was a place where survival often mattered more than ambition, where dreams were viewed as luxuries, and where very few ever managed to escape the cycle of hardship. Even in the midst of those struggles, there was something about them that stood out, a determination, a spark and a restlessness that couldn't be contained by their environment. As a child, they were different. While others seemed content to follow the routines of life, they were always searching for more, absorbing every sound, every influence, every piece of culture they could get their hands on. Music in particular wasn't just entertainment for them, it was a lifeline, a way to escape the weight of their reality. Their first encounters with rhythm and lyrics were raw, unpolished, and deeply personal. Instead of treating music as background noise, they dissected it, studied it, tried to understand how sounds could translate into emotions so powerful they could bring an entire room to silence or ignite it into frenzy. This obsession didn't make them popular, it made them misunderstood. Teachers, classmates, even family members sometimes brushed it off as a distraction, not realizing that this fixation would eventually become their salvation. But alongside the gift was the burden. Early life wasn't kind, and the pressures of poverty, fractured family dynamics, and constant instability left scars that would never truly fade. Friends from those years remember moments when their confidence seemed unshakable, but also times when they withdrew completely, as though battling demons no one else could see. These contradictions defined them from the start, fearless in pursuit of their vision, yet fragile when confronted with the weight of reality. The world would later label them controversial, reckless, or even self-destructive, but those who knew them young understood it differently. They weren't reckless, they were desperate, driven by an urgency to escape circumstances that threatened to suffocate them. There were whispers, even then, about the lengths they would go to achieve success. Some stories paint them as fiercely independent, sneaking out to perform at small venues or open mics where no one knew their name, determined to test themselves against real audiences. Others recall a darker side, rumors of burned bridges and early rivalries sparked before their career had even begun. It's hard to know where the truth ends and exaggeration begins, but what's undeniable is that they left an impression. People remembered them, whether for their raw talent, their sharp tongue, or their refusal to back down. That reputation would follow them into the industry, where it became both their greatest asset and their most dangerous weakness. The struggles of their upbringing weren't just personal, they were systemic. Growing up in a world where opportunities were scarce, they quickly learned that success wasn't going to be handed to them. If they wanted to rise, they would have to fight harder than most, and that fight shaped their personality. It made them relentless, willing to endure sleepless nights, endless rejections, and the humiliation of being overlooked time and time again. But it also left them with a chip on their shoulder, a simmering anger that would later explode in ways both powerful and destructive. It's one thing to chase a dream, it's another to chase it when you believe the entire world is against you. That mindset fueled their hunger, but also planted seeds of paranoia that would resurface when fame finally arrived. Behind the raw determination, though, there were also moments of vulnerability that few ever saw. Childhood friends recall them confiding about fears of failure, about the crushing weight of expectations, and about whether they would ever truly be enough. These doubts didn't stop them, they pushed through them, but they never disappeared. Instead, they became the silent fuel for everything they did, an invisible motivator that drove them to prove themselves over and over again. And yet, no matter how many small victories they achieved, the insecurities never fully went away. That duality, confidence on the surface, doubt underneath, would become one of the defining traits of their career. Even as a teenager, they had a knack for stirring attention. Sometimes it was intentional, other times accidental, but they always seemed to be at the center of something. A fight, a rumor, a performance that left people divided. Love them or hate them, no one could ignore them. That magnetism became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it drew people in, creating early buzz that would later propel them to stardom. On the other, it made them a target for criticism, jealousy, and resentment. Those early experiences of being both celebrated and attacked prepared them for the chaotic relationship they would later have with fame. They learned quickly that attention was a currency, and they became skilled at spending it, sometimes recklessly, but always with impact. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Depending on who you ask, their upbringing was either marked by support or by conflict. Some relatives insist they were nurtured, encouraged, and given the freedom to chase their passions. Others whisper about arguments, neglect, and struggles that left lasting wounds. What seems clear is that their home life was anything but simple, and those complexities seeped into their art. Lyrics filled with themes of betrayal, longing, resilience, and anger weren't just poetic flourishes. They were reflections of lived experience. Fans connected with the rawness because it felt authentic, and authenticity was something this artist never lacked, even when it made people uncomfortable. The truth is, their humble beginnings were never really humble at all. They were dramatic, messy, and already filled with the kind of contradictions that would later make their story so compelling. They weren't just another kid with a dream, they were a storm in the making, a mix of brilliance and chaos waiting to erupt onto a bigger stage. And while the world would later argue about whether they were a genius, a troublemaker, or both, those who knew them from the start weren't surprised by the trajectory. The seeds of everything, the triumphs, the scandals, the controversies were planted in those early years. What makes this chapter so gripping is how it frames everything that comes next. Without understanding their beginnings, the rest of the story makes less sense. The hunger, the recklessness, the vulnerability, and the constant push and pull between confidence and insecurity all trace back to those formative years. Fame didn't create those contradictions, it amplified them, turning private struggles into public drama. And as we move deeper into their story, one thing becomes clear. The rise to fame wasn't just a career path. It was a battle for survival, a desperate attempt to escape a past that refused to let go. Because while most people see stardom as the dream, for them, it was something else entirely. It was a lifeline. And lifelines are never neat, never easy, and never without consequences. The child who once scribbled lyrics in notebooks and fought to be heard in crowded rooms would soon become a name known around the world. But as you'll see, the shadows of their beginnings followed them every step of the way, shaping not only their rise but also their inevitable struggles at the top. Breaking into the industry is never as glamorous as it looks from the outside. For this artist, it was a grueling process marked by rejections, small victories, and the kind of sacrifices that most people never see. To understand their eventual rise, you have to look at the grind that came before the fame, the years of hustling in the shadows, clawing for recognition in spaces that were designed to shut them out. It wasn't about talent alone. Plenty of people had talent. What set them apart was their refusal to stop pushing, even when every door seemed to slam in their face. They weren't born into industry connections or backed by powerful executives. They built their entry point through persistence, controversy, and sheer audacity. The early attempts at making a name for themselves were chaotic and raw, but they carried the same intensity that would later define their career. They started with tiny performances, open mics, and underground showcases where the crowd was small and unforgiving. In those spaces, you couldn't hide behind production or marketing. You either had the ability to grab attention or you didn't. And this artist had it. Their stage presence was electric, unpredictable, sometimes even off-putting, but never boring. Audiences might have left divided, but no one left indifferent. That ability to polarize people, to make them feel strongly one way or another, became their trademark. Long before they had charting songs, they had that magnetism, and it made them unforgettable to anyone who stumbled across their performances. But magnetism alone doesn't guarantee success, and they learned quickly how brutal the industry could be. Record labels dismissed them for being too much, too raw, too controversial, too unpredictable to market safely. Managers passed on them, saying they didn't fit the mold of what was selling at the time. Those rejections fueled a growing resentment, but instead of discouraging them, it sharpened their determination. If the industry wasn't going to open its doors, they would kick them down. They started recording their own demos, passing out mixtapes, and flooding local circuits with their music. They weren't waiting for approval, they were demanding attention. This DIY approach came with its own controversies. There were rumors about disputes with other local artists, accusations of stealing spotlight at shows, and clashes that sometimes turned physical. While most up-and-comers tried to play nice and build networks, this artist leaned into conflict, believing that even bad press was better than no press. And in a way, it worked. Their name began to circulate, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in criticism, but always with curiosity. They understood instinctively what many seasoned artists took years to learn. Attention is currency, and if you can keep people talking about you, you've already won half the battle. The breakthrough wasn't a single event, but a series of escalating moments. First came a viral performance clip, grainy, filmed on a fan's phone, but so captivating that it spread far beyond their local scene. The performance wasn't polished, but it had a raw energy that felt real in an industry oversaturated with artificial perfection. That clip caught the attention of blogs and online communities, who debated endlessly about whether this artist was a genius in the making or a disaster waiting to happen. Then came a controversial interview, where they openly called out bigger names, accusing them of being fake, manufactured, and disconnected from real artistry. The boldness shocked people, but it also drew more eyes to them. In an industry built on careful image control, their recklessness felt like a breath of fresh air to some, and a dangerous provocation to others. Either way, people were watching. Alongside the growing buzz, there were also cracks in their personal life. Friends described those years as some of the most exhausting they had ever seen. Sleepless nights in the studio, constant hustling to book shows, and endless battles with people who didn't believe in them left scars. They burned bridges as quickly as they built them, leaving behind a trail of strained relationships. Yet, despite the chaos, the momentum kept building. Their music was getting sharper, their performances more refined, and their reputation more undeniable. Even the critics who despised them couldn't ignore the sheer willpower driving their climb. What truly set their entry into the industry apart was the way they blurred the line between art and persona. They weren't just making music, they were creating a character, a larger-than-life version of themselves, that people either idolized or despised. That persona wasn't entirely authentic, but it wasn't entirely fake either. It was an amplification of their real contradictions, turned up to maximum volume. It made them unpredictable, and unpredictability kept audiences hooked. Every show, every post, every rumor felt like part of an ongoing saga, and fans followed not just for the music, but for the drama that surrounded it. In many ways, they understood early on that in the digital age, you don't just sell songs, you sell story, and their story was too captivating to ignore. The industry eventually took notice, not because they fit the mold, but because they had made themselves impossible to overlook. After years of rejections, executives who once dismissed them started reaching out, desperate to harness the buzz they had created on their own. But by then the artist wasn't begging for validation. They were negotiating from a place of power, They had built their own following, crafted their own narrative, and proved that they didn't need the industry to survive. The industry needed them. Signing deals and entering bigger stages came with its own compromises, but one thing never changed. They were going to do it on their terms, no matter the cost. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about their entry into the mainstream. Established figures in the industry saw them as a threat, an unpredictable force that could disrupt carefully curated hierarchies. Rumors spread of backroom attempts to blacklist them, of industry veterans warning others not to work with them. But instead of crushing their momentum, the resistance only fueled their outsider image. Fans loved the idea of someone who refused to bow to the system, someone who would rather fight than conform. That rebellious energy became central to their appeal, and it carried them through the transition from underground sensation to mainstream contender. The irony is that breaking into the industry didn't simplify their life, it made it more complicated. The higher they climbed, the more pressure mounted, and the more their contradictions came into focus. They had entered a world where every move was magnified, every mistake broadcast to millions, and every choice dissected by critics and fans alike. The same qualities that made them unforgettable, audacity, rawness, defiance, would soon become double-edged swords. But in these early stages, it all felt like momentum, like nothing could slow them down. Looking back, those years of struggle and controversy were essential to their rise. Without the rejections, they wouldn't have developed their relentless drive. Without the conflicts, they wouldn't have built their notoriety. Without the hunger to prove themselves, they might have faded into obscurity before anyone ever heard their name. Breaking into the industry wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning. But it was the moment that defined everything that came after, the point where their dream shifted from a possibility to a reality, and where the world finally started paying attention. And yet, even as they stood at the edge of stardom, one question lingered. Would the same fire that got them here carry them to the top, or burn them alive in the process? That tension, the balance between triumph and self-destruction, would become the defining thread of their entire career. The rise to fame is never a straight line, and for this artist, it was a storm of contradictions. One moment they were celebrated as a revolutionary voice, the next they were dragged through headlines for their outrageous behavior. Yet somehow, the chaos itself became part of the allure. Fans couldn't stop watching because every new development felt like the next chapter in a story that no one could predict. Fame didn't arrive gently at their door. It crashed into their life like a tidal wave, sweeping away the remnants of their anonymity and replacing it with the intoxicating and suffocating reality of global recognition. What had once been a dream scribbled in notebooks and rehearsed in empty rooms was suddenly real, and with it came both validation and the beginning of a new kind of struggle. Their breakout moment didn't just come from music, it came from spectacle. The release of their first major project shocked the industry, not only because of its raw energy, but because of the persona that accompanied it. They weren't presenting themselves as another polished star playing by the rules. They positioned themselves as the outsider, the disruptor, the one unafraid to say and do the things others only whispered about. The lyrics cut deep, the performances were unpredictable, and the interviews were explosive. Fans felt like they were witnessing authenticity, even when that authenticity looked messy and confrontational. It was the kind of energy that couldn't be manufactured, and in an industry drowning in carefully crafted images, their unpredictability felt refreshing, even dangerous. The project spread like wildfire not just because of its sound, but because of the controversies attached to it. Critics couldn't decide whether it was genius or chaos, but the debate itself made it unmissable. Songs went viral not only for their catchy hooks, but also for the rumors surrounding them, alleged disses aimed at rivals, hidden references to personal feuds, and lyrics so raw they seemed to peel back layers of their own life. Fans analyzed every word, every line, looking for clues to the drama that was unfolding both on and off the stage. That hunger for more kept the spotlight locked firmly on them, turning each release into an event. As their fame grew, so did the spectacle. Sold-out shows became the norm, and each performance carried an energy that felt both electric and volatile. They didn't just perform songs, they created moments, unpredictable and often controversial ones. One night they might deliver a flawless show that left fans in awe, and the next they might walk off stage mid-performance or ignite a feud live in front of thousands. These antics drove critics wild, but for fans it only made the experience more thrilling. Every ticket to their show felt like a gamble, You never knew whether you were about to witness brilliance, disaster, or both at the same time. The media, of course, latched onto every controversy. Tabloids painted them as reckless, unstable, even dangerous at times. But those headlines only seemed to fuel their fame. In a digital era where attention is everything, every scandal became free publicity. Fans defended them fiercely, framing the criticism as proof that the industry couldn't handle someone so real, so unfiltered. Detractors, meanwhile, predicted an inevitable downfall, convinced that their self-destructive tendencies would catch up sooner rather than later. But regardless of which side you were on, you were watching, and that was all that mattered. With fame came wealth, and with wealth came an entirely new world of temptations and challenges. They suddenly had access to everything they once dreamed of: lavish homes, expensive cars, entourages, and endless opportunities. But the same excess that symbolized their success also magnified their flaws. Late nights turned into wild parties, friendships turned into alliances and betrayals, and personal struggles that had once been private now played out in front of millions. It was as though fame had amplified every part of their personality: the brilliance, the chaos, the vulnerability, and the recklessness, until nothing was left in moderation. Despite the controversies, or perhaps because of them, their influence expanded beyond music. Fashion brands wanted them as the face of campaigns, magazines fought for cover stories, and talk shows booked them knowing full well that chaos could erupt at any moment. They weren't just a musician anymore, they were a cultural figure, someone whose presence guaranteed attention. And in the age of clicks and streams, attention was the most valuable currency. Even when the headlines were negative, the numbers told a different story. Streams were climbing, ticket sales were soaring, and their fan base was growing more loyal with every scandal. But the rise to fame wasn't just about public spectacle, it also carried a personal cost. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. Friends and insiders described moments where the weight of expectations seemed unbearable, where they confided doubts about whether they could handle the machine they had created. There were whispers of struggles with substances, of breakdowns hidden from the public, of paranoia about who could be trusted in their rapidly expanding circle. The very fame they had fought so hard for was now a double-edged sword, giving them everything they wanted while threatening to destroy them from within. Their relationships became another focal point of public fascination. Every romance, every feud, every friendship turned sour became fodder for speculation. Social media only amplified the drama, with fans and critics dissecting posts, likes, and cryptic messages as though they were pieces of a puzzle. The artist played into this at times, dropping hints, stirring rumors, and fueling speculation with carefully chosen words or provocative actions. They understood that the story around their life was just as powerful as the music itself, and they used it to keep the world's eyes locked on them. What made their rise so unique was the constant unpredictability. Most stars follow a trajectory: small buzz, breakout hit, slow climb to mainstream stability. But with this artist, there was no stability, only their career felt like a roller coaster, with no safety rails, thrilling and terrifying all at once. And while many critics predicted that the chaos would eventually collapse, fans lived for it. The volatility became the brand, the sense that at any moment, something shocking could happen. In a landscape oversaturated with predictable stars, that danger made them irresistible. Looking back, the rise to fame wasn't about perfection, it was about impact. Every song, every performance, every controversy left an imprint that people couldn't ignore. They didn't just climb the charts, they dominated conversations, and in the modern era that was arguably even more powerful. But with the world now watching their every move, the stakes were higher than ever. Every mistake would be magnified, every feud would escalate faster, and every personal struggle would risk becoming public fodder. The irony is that while the world was enthralled by the spectacle, the artist was still the same person who had started in obscurity, driven by the same hunger, haunted by the same insecurities, and carrying the same contradictions. Fame hadn't erased those struggles. It had simply placed them under a brighter light. And as the story of their rise unfolded, one question began to loom over everything. Could they control the chaos they had built their empire on, or would the very thing that made them famous become the thing that destroyed them? The rise to fame was dazzling, explosive, and unforgettable, but it was also the start of an even darker chapter, because if getting to the top is hard, staying there is far harder, especially when the spotlight exposes not just your brilliance, but your flaws. At the height of their fame, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. Their songs dominated charts, their face appeared on billboards across cities, and every word they spoke turned into a headline. The world couldn't get enough, and they fed off that energy, thriving in the chaos of constant attention. For fans, this was the golden era. Every release felt like an event, every performance an unforgettable spectacle, every scandal another reason to stay glued to the story. But hidden beneath the surface, cracks had already started to form, cracks that fame only made wider, because while the world celebrated their peak, behind the scenes they were fighting battles that would eventually make this high point look more like the calm before the storm. The numbers told a story of success beyond imagination. Multi-platinum records, sold-out tours, endorsements worth millions, the kind of achievements most artists only dream of. But numbers can't capture the toll that comes with living life under a microscope. Every decision they made was dissected, every mistake magnified, and every relationship turned into a spectacle for the public to devour. At first they embraced it, using controversy as fuel for their persona, but the longer they lived in that spotlight, the harder it became to tell where the performance ended and the person began. Fans thought they knew the real them, but even they admitted in private that the line between authenticity and image had blurred beyond recognition. The pressure of maintaining success was relentless. What had once been a dream was now an expectation, and the industry around them demanded constant reinvention. Labels wanted hits that were bigger than the last, managers pushed for tours that left no room for rest, and the media demanded sound bites that could go viral. The machine of fame was never satisfied, and no matter how much they gave, it always asked for more. The exhaustion began to show, first in subtle ways: cancelled interviews, late appearances, inconsistent performances. Fans brushed it off as the natural wear and tear of stardom, but those who were close to them knew better. They weren't just tired, they were unraveling. Behind the scenes, their personal life was spiraling in ways that the public only glimpsed through rumors. Parties that started as celebrations turned into all-night benders, relationships collapsed under the weight of trust issues and betrayals, and their inner circle became more fractured as money and fame drove wedges between once loyal friends. There were whispers of paranoia, of constant suspicion that those around them were only there for the ride, not out of genuine loyalty. These insecurities weren't new, they had been there since the beginning, but fame amplified them until every friendship, every business deal, every romance felt like a potential trap. And then there were the scandals, the ones too big to ignore. Headlines screamed about altercations, lawsuits, leaked recordings, and accusations that threatened to tarnish the empire they had built. Some of these stories were exaggerated, fueled by tabloids desperate for clicks, but others carried enough truth to sting. Each controversy chipped away at the polished narrative of success, revealing glimpses of the chaos bubbling underneath. Fans defended them fiercely, insisting the media was out to destroy them, but even the most loyal supporters couldn't deny that the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. What made this period so compelling was the contradiction between the public triumph and the private turmoil. On stage, they were larger than life, commanding crowds of tens of thousands with a presence that felt untouchable. Off stage, they were battling demons that fame had only intensified. The same fire that made them magnetic was now threatening to burn them out completely. It was as if the world had handed them everything they wanted, only for the weight of it to nearly crush them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who paid close attention. The higher they rose, the more fragile they became. And yet, despite the chaos, their influence continued to grow. They weren't just an artist anymore, they had become a cultural phenomenon. Their fashion choices set trends, their social media posts sparked debates, and their name was synonymous with both brilliance and controversy. They had reached the level of fame where even silence became newsworthy, where a single cryptic post could send millions into speculation. But with that level of visibility came a trap. Every misstep, no matter how small, became magnified 100 times over, and as the missteps piled up, the cracks widened. Friends and collaborators described this period as one of extremes. There were moments of brilliance, creative bursts where they produced some of their best work, moments of generosity where they gave back to communities, nights where their charisma could light up an entire room. But these highs were often followed by devastating lows, days of isolation, erratic behavior, and outbursts that alienated even those closest to them. The swings between the two became sharper, more dramatic, and more public, creating a sense that the entire empire was balanced on a knife's edge. What fans didn't see was how much of the chaos was rooted in fear. Fear of losing relevance, fear of being exposed as flawed, fear of letting down the millions who saw them as more than human. The pressure to maintain the image they had built was suffocating, and instead of finding stability and success, they spiraled deeper into instability. The very fame they had once chased now felt like a cage, and every attempt to break free only seemed to tighten the bars. It's easy to look at peak fame as the pinnacle of success, but for this artist it was more complicated. Yes, they were at the top of the world, celebrated and envied in equal measure, but at the same time they were standing on fragile ground, with every crack threatening to swallow them whole. The applause was deafening, but behind the noise was silence that felt unbearable, and while fans continued to cheer, the artist themselves was beginning to wonder whether the price of fame had been too high. The cracks showing during this period weren't just signs of personal struggle, they were warnings of what was to come. The scandals, the breakdowns, the controversies, they weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of deeper fractures that fame had only accelerated. And as much as the world loved watching the rise, it would soon become even more obsessed with the fall. Because if there's one thing the public loves more than building someone up, it's watching them come crashing down. This was the paradox of their peak. At the very moment they seemed invincible, they were more vulnerable than ever. And those who were paying attention knew that the story was far from over. The cracks were no longer just whispers in the background. They were front-page news, and the question wasn't if everything would come crashing down, but when. At the height of fame, scandal has a way of clinging to stars like shadows. For this artist, the shadows didn't just cling, they consumed. Every move they made became headline material. Every whispered rumor spun into a firestorm, and every misstep magnified until it seemed larger than the music itself. This was the chapter where the story turned darker, when the narrative of brilliance became inseparable from chaos, and when the world discovered just how fragile our empire really was. What made it even more shocking was the speed at which everything unraveled. One day, they were celebrated as a cultural icon. The next, they were at the center of controversies that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The first scandal that truly shook everything wasn't about their music at all. It was about their behavior. A heated altercation backstage at a major award show spiraled out of control. And though the details varied depending on who told the story, the result was the same. Headlines across every outlet, painting them as volatile, aggressive, and unhinged. Footage leaked online, capturing just enough to fuel speculation but not enough to reveal the full truth. Fans defended them, insisting they were provoked, while critics used it as proof that the artist had always been a ticking time bomb. Overnight, the conversation shifted from their talent to their temper, and the narrative of the troubled genius began to take root. But scandals rarely arrive alone. No sooner had the industry begun digesting the fallout from the altercation than a series of accusations surfaced. Stories of betrayal from within their own circle, claims of broken contracts, and whispers of unpaid debts. Former collaborators came forward with grievances, some airing them publicly in interviews and social media posts. Whether all of these claims were true didn't matter. The fact that they existed was enough to damage their image. The perception of someone who couldn't be trusted began to grow, and in an industry where loyalty is already fragile, that perception can be devastating. Then came the personal scandals. Relationships that had once been fodder for romantic headlines now turned toxic in the public eye. Breakups played out like soap operas, complete with cryptic social media posts, public arguments, and leaked private messages that hinted at infidelity and betrayal. Every new revelation sent shockwaves through the fan base, dividing supporters and critics even further. For some, the drama only made them more fascinating, proof that they were living life unapologetically and on their own terms. For others, it was a sign of self-destruction, evidence that fame had eroded their ability to maintain any sense of stability. Either way, people couldn't look away. The scandals weren't limited to personal drama. Legal issues soon followed, dragging them further into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. There were reports of lawsuits, some from former associates, others from corporations claiming breach of contract. Paparazzi captured them leaving courthouses, and each photo seemed to tell a story of someone weighed down by battles they couldn't win. Even when cases were settled quietly, the damage to their reputation was loud and undeniable. The image of the fearless disruptor was morphing into something else entirely, a cautionary tale of fame spinning out of control. What made these scandals particularly damaging was the way they overshadowed the music. Where once fans dissected every lyric for hidden meanings, now the analysis focused on scandals and rumors. The art became background noise to the spectacle, and while their notoriety kept them in the headlines, the attention wasn't the kind that built legacies. Instead, it chipped away at the credibility they had fought so hard to earn. Critics gleefully pointed out the shift, publishing think pieces about wasted potential and the dangers of unchecked fame. Supporters argued back, but even they couldn't deny that the focus had changed. Through it all, the artists leaned into the chaos, at least publicly. They dismissed criticisms in interviews, fired off defiant social media posts, and sometimes even mocked the scandals themselves. But behind the bravado, insiders described a very different reality. Moments of isolation, breakdowns away from cameras, and paranoia that the world was conspiring to tear them down. The persona they presented to the world was bold and unshaken, but the person behind it was fraying under the weight of constant scrutiny. The scandals also created a ripple effect in the industry. Partnerships began to crumble as brands grew wary of associating with someone whose name was increasingly linked to controversy. Deals that had once been easy to secure suddenly evaporated, leaving gaps in revenue that only added to the tension. Even within the music industry, collaborators hesitated, worried that working with them might bring backlash or bad press. It was a vicious cycle. The more scandals piled up, the more isolated they became, and the more isolated they became, the easier it was for the scandals to define them. What made the situation all the more tragic was how preventable some of it could have been. Many of the controversies stemmed not from malice, but from recklessness, unguarded moments, heated tempers, poor decisions made under pressure. But in the world of fame, recklessness doesn't fade quietly. It explodes, amplified by tabloids, social media, and the insatiable appetite of fans and critics alike. Each mistake became not just a personal setback, but a public spectacle, broadcast and debated, until it became part of the larger narrative. And yet, despite the chaos, there was an undeniable allure to it all. The scandals, as damaging as they were, kept them at the center of attention. Fans tuned in not just for the music, but for the drama, eager to see what would happen next. It was as though the artist's life had become a serialized story, with each new scandal another plot twist. For better or worse, they had mastered the art of staying relevant, even when the relevance came at the cost of their own peace of mind. The irony of this chapter lies in how it redefined their legacy. The scandals that threatened to destroy them also cemented them as one of the most talked about figures of their generation. Love them or hate them, people couldn't stop discussing them. Their name became shorthand for controversy, their image a symbol of both brilliance and disaster. And while some fans longed for a return to the focus on music, others embraced the chaos as part of the package. The scandals that shook everything weren't just isolated incidents, they were turning points, each one pulling them further into a cycle that would prove increasingly hard to escape. The more the cracks showed, the more the world leaned in, fascinated by the spectacle. And while scandals can sometimes be weathered, this series of storms left scars too deep to ignore. The empire was still standing, but its foundations had been shaken, and everyone watching knew it was only a matter of time before the next collapse. Fallout is a strange thing in the world of fame. It doesn't hit all at once like an explosion, it spreads slowly, creeping into every part of life until even the victories feel hollow. For this artist, the consequences of their scandals came in waves, each one stripping away another layer of the empire they had built. At first it seemed manageable. They had survived controversies before, and for a while it looked like this would be no different. Fans still packed arenas, songs still charted, and their name remained on everyone's lips. But the difference this time was the accumulation. Too many battles had been fought, too many fires had been lit, and the weight of it all began to crush even the strongest parts of their image. The fallout started quietly, almost invisibly, with subtle shifts that outsiders didn't notice right away. Invitations to high-profile events stopped arriving. Endorsement deals, once eager to feature them in glossy campaigns, began to vanish without explanation. Collaborators who once fought to be in their orbit now kept their distance, worried that proximity could turn into collateral damage. The silence was louder than the scandals themselves. The artist, once celebrated as untouchable, now carried a reputation that made people hesitant to stand too close. Even allies who had defended them through previous storms began to falter, exhausted by the endless cycle of drama. Financial consequences soon followed. Lavish spending had always been part of their lifestyle. Mansions, luxury cars, entourages, and nights that seemed to burn through money like fuel. When the revenue was endless, it felt sustainable, even invincible. But as brand partnerships dried up and cancelled deals mounted, the cracks in their finances started to show. Whispers circulated of debts piling up, of lawsuits draining resources, of once loyal team members leaving after unpaid wages, or disputes over money. For an artist who had built their image on excess and grandeur, the appearance of financial instability was devastating, not just practically but symbolically. It signaled that the empire was not as indestructible as it once seemed, but the deepest consequences weren't financial, they were personal. The relentless spotlight, the betrayals, and the pressure of maintaining an image had taken their toll. Friends described them as more isolated than ever, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Trust had become nearly impossible. Every new person in their circle was met with suspicion. Were they genuine, or were they looking to exploit the chaos for their own gain? Paranoia set in, fueled by the reality that some scandals had indeed come from leaks within their inner circle. The sense of being constantly watched, constantly judged, made even private moments feel suffocating. The emotional fallout was evident in their behavior, where once they thrived on unpredictability, their actions now seemed erratic, less like calculated spectacle and more like cries for help. Public appearances grew inconsistent. Sometimes they arrived brimming with charisma. Other times they seemed withdrawn, disoriented, or explosive. Fans speculated endlessly about their mental state, with debates raging online about whether they were spiraling out of control or simply misunderstood. Each appearance became a litmus test, each performance dissected for signs of resilience or collapse. The very audience that had once celebrated their volatility now questioned whether it had become their undoing. The industry, too, began to show its true colors. When they were rising, their unpredictability was tolerated, even celebrated, because it kept the spotlight bright. But once the controversies overshadowed the music, the same qualities that once made them fascinating were labeled liabilities. Promoters hesitated to book them. Labels grew cautious about funding new projects, and executives whispered about whether the artist had become more trouble than they were worth. It was a brutal reminder of how conditional the industry's loyalty could be. Celebration when you're useful, abandonment when you're not. Yet, despite the consequences, there was still a lingering fascination. Their every move continued to dominate conversations. Their names still trended at the drop of a hat, and their story remained one of the most watched in entertainment. That paradox of being both shunned and obsessed over was perhaps the cruelest fallout of all. They could not escape the attention even as it suffocated them. The public wanted the chaos, but the chaos was destroying them. One of the most painful consequences was the shift in their relationship with their fans. The core supporters, the ones who had been there from the beginning, remained loyal, defending them against critics and insisting the world was conspiring against their favorite. But even within the fan base, fractures began to appear. Some grew frustrated by the lack of new music or the seemingly endless scandals. Others worried openly about their well-being, torn between supporting the persona and worrying about the person behind it. The relationship that had once felt unbreakable now showed signs of strain, and in the world of fame, losing your base can be more devastating than losing industry support. The fallout also forced the artists to confront themselves in ways they had long avoided. Stripped of some of the noise, they faced the reality that the scandals weren't just happening to them. They were, in many ways, a product of their own choices. That realization was painful, and while they resisted admitting it publicly, those closest to them saw glimpses of self-awareness, moments where they expressed regret, where they questioned whether it had all been worth it, where they wondered aloud if the pursuit of fame had been a mistake. These moments of honesty were fleeting, often buried beneath bravado and defiance, that they revealed a vulnerability that few had ever seen. The broader consequence of this period was the transformation of their legacy. No longer were they viewed solely as an innovator, a disruptor, or a trailblazer. Their story now carried the weight of caution, the label of tragedy, and the lingering question of what could have been if things had gone differently. Critics framed them as another example of fame's destructive power, while supporters clung to the hope of redemption. The narrative was no longer entirely in their control, and that loss of agency was perhaps the most difficult consequence of all. What made the fallout so gripping was its inevitability. The cracks had been visible long before the collapse. The warnings had been there in every scandal, every feud, every reckless decision, and yet, when the consequences finally arrived, they still felt shocking, as though no one believed the story would actually play out this way. The empire had seemed too big, the persona too powerful, the presence too magnetic to truly falter. But fame is unforgiving, and in the end, no one escapes without paying a price. This chapter wasn't the end of their story, but it was a turning point. The fallout reshaped everything: their career, their relationships, their legacy, and their sense of self. The consequences weren't just setbacks. They were scars that couldn't be erased, reminders of a rise and peak that had burned too brightly, too recklessly. And while some hoped they could rebuild, others believed the damage was irreversible. The truth, as always with this artist, lay somewhere in the contradiction, caught between resilience and ruin, between redemption and collapse, between the person they were and the persona they had created. Redemption in the world of fame is never simple, and for this artist it was especially complicated. After the storms of scandals and the fallout that left their career bruised and reputation battered, the question wasn't whether they could make a comeback, it was whether anyone would allow them the chance. Public opinion had become a battlefield, with critics writing them off as finished while loyal fans clung to the belief that the story wasn't over. Redemption, however, isn't handed out like applause. It has to be fought for, earned in the most unforgiving spotlight imaginable. And that's exactly what they set out to do. The first step toward redemption was survival. Before they could talk about comebacks, they had to show that they could weather the storm. For a while, silence became their most powerful weapon. After years of chaos and constant noise, they disappeared from the spotlight, retreating from interviews, cancelling appearances, and stepping back from the endless cycle of spectacle. At first, this silence sparked more speculation. Had they finally burned out, or were they preparing something bigger? But slowly the absence began to shift the narrative. For once, people weren't seeing headlines about scandals, they were seeing nothing at all. And in the vacuum, curiosity grew. The world had gotten so used to their constant presence that the mystery of their absence became its own kind of allure. Behind the scenes, however, silence wasn't the same as stillness. They were rebuilding, piece by piece, both personally and professionally. Friends close to them describe a period of reflection, where they began to confront the choices that had led to their downfall. Therapy sessions, conversations with mentors, and attempts at reconciling with estranged friends and family became part of this rebuilding process. These moments rarely made the headlines, but they were essential. For perhaps the first time in their career, they weren't focused on image. They were focused on survival and growth. When they finally returned to the public eye, it wasn't with a grand announcement or an explosive stunt. It was subtle, almost cautious, a post on social media, understated and raw, hinting at self-awareness without begging for forgiveness. The caption was short, almost cryptic, but it carried a weight that fans latched onto, a recognition that mistakes had been made, that lessons had been learned, and that the story wasn't finished yet. Within hours, the post trended worldwide, not because it was scandalous, but because it was human. After years of defiance and spectacle, here was a glimpse of vulnerability, and it struck a chord. The next step came through the music itself. Redemption in the entertainment industry is rarely achieved through words alone. It has to come through art. Their first project after the scandals was anticipated with a mix of excitement and skepticism. Would it be a triumphant return or a desperate attempt to stay relevant? When the music dropped, it surprised nearly everyone. The sound was rawer, more introspective, stripped of some of the bravado that had defined earlier work. The lyrics hinted at regret, at struggles with fame, at battles with inner demons. It wasn't a perfect project, but it was honest, and honesty is a powerful currency in a world where so much feels manufactured. Fans embraced it as proof that the artist hadn't lost their talent, while critics, though cautious, admitted that there was something genuine in the effort. Of course, redemption didn't come without setbacks. The media wasn't eager to forget the scandals, and every new move was dissected for signs of relapse into old habits. A single misstep could send headlines spiraling again, and on more than one occasion minor controversies threatened to derail the progress they were making. But what set this period apart was how they responded. Instead of lashing out or feeding the flames, they learned to step back, to acknowledge flaws without fueling chaos. Slowly, the narrative began to shift, not entirely in their favor, but enough to suggest that change was possible. One of the most surprising parts of their redemption arc was the reconciliation with rivals. Feuds had once been a cornerstone of their image, fueling drama and headlines that kept them at the center of attention. But in an unexpected turn, they began reaching out to those same rivals, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, extending olive branches where no one thought reconciliation was possible. Collaborations that once seemed unthinkable began to take shape, shocking fans and critics alike. These moments weren't just good publicity, they were symbolic, signaling that the artist was willing to evolve beyond the chaos that had defined their earlier years. Philanthropy also became a key part of their redemption journey. In an effort to rebuild their image, they began giving back in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. Donations to charities, appearances at community events, and initiatives aimed at supporting young artists became part of their new narrative. While skeptics questioned the motives, fans saw it as proof of growth, a sign that the artist was trying to use their platform for something greater than themselves. These acts didn't erase the past, but they helped paint a more complex picture, one where mistakes and redemption coexist. The redemption arc wasn't smooth, and it wasn't universally accepted. Some critics remained unmoved, arguing that no amount of good deeds or honest music could erase the damage of the scandals. But others, including fans who had once drifted away, found themselves drawn back in by the vulnerability, the effort, and the undeniable talent that had always been at the core of the story. The contradictions remained bold yet vulnerable, brilliant yet flawed, but this time, the contradictions felt less destructive and more human. What made the redemption attempt so captivating was the uncertainty. Unlike the rise to fame, which seemed unstoppable, the comeback was fragile, uncertain, always at risk of collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. That fragility made every step more compelling. Would they stay the course, or would old habits resurface? Would the world embrace the redemption story, or would it forever define them by their scandals? Each move carried the tension of those questions, and the unpredictability kept people watching. In the end, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about proving that the story didn't have to end there. For the artist, every step forward was a reminder that they were more than their mistakes, more than their scandals, more than the persona that fame had turned into a prison. The attempts at redemption weren't perfect, and they didn't satisfy everyone, but they represented growth, resilience, and the possibility of rewriting a legacy that many thought was already sealed. Redemption in fame is always temporary, always fragile, always conditional on the next move. But for this artist, the attempts mattered because they showed that they weren't done fighting, that the same drive that once fueled their rise could also fuel their rebuilding, and whether they succeeded fully or not, the very act of trying became part of their story, adding a new layer to a saga that had always been defined by extremes. The comeback wasn't just about music or image, it was about survival, about proving to themselves and the world that they could fall, shatter, and still find a way to stand again. Public opinion is never static, and when it comes to an artist whose career has been built on controversy, spectacle, and brilliance, it can shift overnight. For this artist, the attempts at redemption sparked a reaction that was as divided as it was intense. Some saw the effort as genuine, a chance to heal, rebuild, and reclaim the legacy that had been slipping away. Others dismissed it as a performance, a carefully crafted attempt to manipulate the narrative and win back an audience that had grown tired of chaos. The result was a cultural split, two camps of people, both watching closely, both convinced they understood the truth, and both unwilling to let go of the fascination that surrounded them. On one side were the loyalists. These were the fans who had been there from the beginning, who had defended the artist through every scandal, every headline, every public meltdown. To them, the comeback wasn't just believable, it was inevitable. They saw vulnerability in the new music, sincerity in the quieter public appearances, and courage in the willingness to confront past mistakes. For these supporters, the redemption arc represented growth, a sign that the person behind the persona was finally taking control of their story again. Online forums, fan pages, and social media threads lit up with messages of encouragement, sharing personal stories about how the artist's struggles mirrored their own battles, making the redemption attempts not just relatable but inspiring. But then there were the skeptics. To them, the redemption narrative was nothing more than a PR strategy, a calculated move to regain favor in an industry that thrives on reinvention. They pointed to past patterns, moments where the artist had seemed contrite, only to spiral back into chaos, and argued that this was simply another act in the performance. For these critics, the music was less about honesty and more about optics, designed to win sympathy without addressing the deeper issues that had caused the scandals in the first place. Every public gesture, whether a donation, a collaboration, or an olive branch to a former rival, was dissected for ulterior motives. To this group, redemption was not only undeserved but impossible, because the damage had already been done. The divide wasn't just between fans and critics, it ran through the media as well. Some outlets embraced the redemption story, publishing glowing features about the artist's growth, resilience, and newfound focus. Headlines framed them as a survivor, a figure who had stumbled but refused to stay down. Others, however, weren't so forgiving. They published biting op-eds, questioning the authenticity of the comeback, highlighting unresolved lawsuits, lingering feuds, and past behaviors that contradicted the narrative of change. The media war became its own spectacle, with opposing takes fueling debates across platforms. For every headline declaring the return of a legend, there was another dismissing them as the same chaos rebranded. Social media amplified the divide, turning every new development into a trending topic. Fans and critics clashed in the comments, battles breaking out under posts that were meant to be celebratory but quickly devolved into argument. Memes, hashtags, and viral threads turned the redemption story into both a source of support and ridicule. Some users celebrated the growth, while others mocked it as insincere. The artists themselves leaned into the conversation carefully, neither over-explaining nor retreating completely. Their strategy was to let the work speak for itself, but in the court of public opinion, silence often fuels speculation just as much as words. What made the public's divided reaction so fascinating was how personal it felt for many. This wasn't just about whether they liked the music or believed the apologies. It was about what the artist represented. To some, they symbolized resilience, proof that even the most flawed individuals could change, adapt, and fight their way back. To others, they embodied everything wrong with celebrity culture, the ability to behave recklessly, cause damage, and then use money and influence to wipe the slate clean. The debates weren't just about one artist, they were about fame, forgiveness, and the line between accountability and redemption. Even within the fan base, the division created tension. Longtime supporters sometimes clashed with newer fans who discovered the artist during the comeback and weren't as invested in defending the past. Some argued that fans should hold their idols accountable, while others insisted that unconditional loyalty was the only true form of support. The debates became so heated that online communities fractured, splintering into subgroups where people could align with others who shared their perspective. The very fan base that had once been united by passion now mirrored the broader cultural divide, proof that redemption stories are never simple, never universally embraced. The public's divided reaction also influenced the industry. Some collaborators jumped at the chance to be part of the comeback, eager to align with the narrative of growth and resilience. Others, however, stayed away, wary of backlash from the skeptical side of the public. Industry executives watched closely, trying to gauge whether the redemption arc would pay off or collapse under its own contradictions. It was a reminder that in fame, perception often matters as much as reality. If enough people believed in the comeback, opportunities would flow again. If too many dismissed it, the door could close permanently. For the artist, navigating this divided landscape was a test, unlike any they had faced before. During their rise, the chaos had been part of the appeal, but now the chaos threatened to overshadow the sincerity of their efforts. Every move was high stakes, every choice a gamble between winning back trust or confirming suspicions. And yet, the unpredictability that had once been their greatest weapon also worked in their favor. Because the truth was, people couldn't stop watching. Whether rooting for redemption or waiting for failure, the public's obsession ensured that the spotlight remained firmly on them. The divided reaction also highlighted a deeper truth about fame. It isn't just about talent or scandal, it's about storytelling. Audiences don't just consume music, they consume the narrative surrounding it. And this artist's story was one of the most compelling of their generation, filled with rises, falls, and comebacks that felt almost cinematic. The redemption arc, regardless of whether it was embraced or rejected, added another layer to the saga. Even skeptics couldn't look away, because in the unpredictability of the artist's life, there was always the possibility of another twist. Ultimately, the public's divided reaction didn't settle the question of redemption, it amplified it. Instead of a clear path forward, the artist found themselves in a liminal space, suspended between forgiveness and rejection, brilliance and chaos, survival and collapse. Some believed wholeheartedly in the new chapter, others dismissed it as an illusion, but both sides remained engaged, invested, and vocal. And in the world of fame, attention, whether supportive or critical, is the lifeblood of relevance. The irony of this period was that the division itself became part of the redemption story. The debates, the clashes, the passionate defenses and harsh criticisms, all of it kept the artist at the center of cultural conversation. Redemption may not have been fully achieved, but the attempt had reignited the fascination, ensuring that they remained one of the most compelling figures in entertainment. In a way, the public's divided reaction was both a challenge and a victory, proof that even after everything, people still cared enough to argue, to invest, and to watch. Legacy is a word that carries weight, especially in the world of music and fame, where careers are often measured not just by the number of hits or the size of the crowds, but by the imprint left behind once the lights go dim. For this artist, legacy was never something distant or abstract. It was a force that loomed over every decision, every controversy, and every attempt at redemption. From the beginning, their journey wasn't just about creating music. It was about building an identity, shaping a story that would outlast the fleeting nature of trends. But legacies are not neat, polished monuments. They are messy, complicated, and often contradict. And as the dust settled from years of chaos, comebacks, and divided public opinion, the question became clear: what would their legacy actually be? On one level, the answer seemed obvious. Their influence on the industry was undeniable. They had rewritten the rules of what an artist could be, blending genres, defying labels, and pushing boundaries in ways that shocked traditionalists but inspired a new generation. Their sound didn't just top charts, it reshaped them, creating space for voices that had once been ignored or dismissed. Young artists openly credited them as an influence, citing their boldness as the reason they dared to take risks. In this sense, their legacy as a pioneer was secure. Even critics who dismissed their antics couldn't deny the seismic shifts they had triggered in music and culture. But legacy is never just about art. It's about the stories attached to it. And here, things became more complicated. For every fan who praised their groundbreaking contributions, there was another who pointed to the scandals, the feuds, the self-destructive choices. Some argued that their legacy would always be tarnished by the chaos that seemed to follow them, that their name would forever be tied not just to innovation but to controversy. Others countered that the chaos was part of what made them legendary, that the flaws and contradictions gave the story depth, making them unforgettable in ways a squeaky clean career never could. This tension between brilliance and chaos became the defining element of their legacy. Few artists managed to remain compelling after their peak, but this one had achieved a strange kind of immortality by refusing to be predictable. Their legacy wasn't just in the music, it was in the narrative, the sense that at any moment another twist could arrive. Another reinvention could shake the culture. Even when absent from the spotlight, their influence lingered, their name invoked in debates about fame, accountability, and artistry. The unpredictability itself became a legacy, ensuring that they were never easily forgotten. What also shaped their legacy was the way they forced conversations that many preferred to avoid. Through their struggles, the public was confronted with uncomfortable questions about mental health, addiction, the pressures of fame, and the role of the industry in exploiting artists for profit. Their controversies weren't just scandals, they were mirrors, reflecting the darker realities of celebrity culture. In this sense, their legacy extended beyond music, becoming part of broader cultural discussions that changed how audiences viewed fame. They exposed the contradictions of a system that builds stars up only to tear them down, a system that feeds on vulnerability while punishing it at the same time. Yet, for all the chaos, there were undeniable moments of beauty in their work. Songs that captured raw emotion, performances that electrified audiences, lyrics that spoke truths too often buried beneath the noise of scandal. These moments became the anchors of their legacy, the reminders that behind the persona and the headlines was a talent that couldn't be ignored. Fans clung to these pieces of art, insisting that no matter what happened in their personal life, the music itself would endure. And perhaps that's the most powerful aspect of legacy, the ability of art to outlast the flaws of the artist. As time passed, perspective began to shift. The immediate scandals lost some of their sting, and what remained was the broader picture, a career that had been as chaotic as it was groundbreaking. Documentaries, retrospectives, and think pieces started reframing the narrative, placing the artist within a lineage of troubled geniuses, whose imperfections only amplified their impact. Critics who once dismissed them began revisiting the music with fresh ears, acknowledging the innovation that had been overshadowed by drama. The legacy was no longer just about mistakes, it was about survival, reinvention, and the refusal to be silenced. But the story of their legacy wasn't just written by critics or fans, it was shaped by the artists themselves. In interviews, they began reflecting more openly on their journey, acknowledging the damage they had caused while also defending their right to be complicated, flawed, and human. These reflections added new layers to the legacy, painting a picture not of a mythic figure, but of a person who had lived at the extremes of fame and paid the price for it. In a world obsessed with polished narratives, this raw honesty set them apart, making their legacy feel more authentic, more relatable, and ultimately more enduring. The divided reaction of the public, ironically, strengthened the legacy rather than weakened it. Because legacies are not built on consensus, they're built on conversation, debate, and the emotions they stir in people. The fact that some adored them while others despised them meant they mattered, that they had carved a place in culture that could not be ignored. Love them or hate them, people had an opinion, and that opinion kept the story alive. In the end, the worst fate for any artist is indifference, and indifference was never part of their story. Their legacy also raised bigger questions about what it means to separate the art from the artist. Could people embrace the music without endorsing the scandals? Could the brilliance be celebrated without excusing the flaws? These debates became part of their cultural imprint, ensuring that their story wasn't just about one individual but about the way society grapples with fame, morality, and art. For better or worse, their career forced people to confront these questions, making their legacy not just artistic but philosophical. Ultimately, the legacy in the making was one of contradictions. It was about brilliance and chaos, triumphs and failures, growth and relapse. It was a legacy that refused to be simplified, one that demanded people engage with the complexity rather than the illusion. And perhaps that's what made it so powerful, because while many stars fade into obscurity once the hits stop coming, this artist's story remained alive, pulsing with tension, inspiring new interpretations, new debates, and new waves of influence. In the end, their legacy wasn't about being perfect, it was about being unforgettable, and whether history remembers them as a genius, a cautionary tale, or something in between, one thing was certain: their impact would echo long after the final curtain, proof that some stories are too big, too messy, and too magnetic to ever be erased. Every story has a moment where everything shifts, a crossroads where the past collides with the future, and nothing can remain the same. For this artist, that moment wasn't announced with flashing lights or triumphant headlines. It came quietly, almost unexpectedly, in the aftermath of years defined by turbulence. By this point, they had lived through the highs of fame, the brutal sting of scandal, the exhausting battle of comebacks, and the constant scrutiny of a public that never stopped watching. But the turning point wasn't about spectacle, it was about a choice, one that would determine whether their story would be remembered as a tragedy or a transformation. What made this moment so striking was that it didn't look like the grand redemptions people often expect from stars. There was no sudden apology tour, no orchestrated publicity stunt designed to win back favor. Instead, the shift began behind the scenes, in the places where no cameras were present. Those closest to the artist recall how the energy around them began to change. They weren't chasing headlines anymore, or feeding feuds to keep themselves relevant. For once, there was a calmness, a focus, as though they had grown tired of the cycle that had consumed so much of their life. It wasn't resignation, it was clarity. They finally understood that if they didn't take control of their story, someone else always would. The turning point also came with a decision to redefine what success meant. For years, success had been measured in numbers, chart positions, streaming counts, ticket sales, magazine covers, but at this juncture, those markers no longer carried the same weight. The artist began talking about legacy instead of fame, about meaning instead of metrics. This shift in perspective was subtle but monumental. It allowed them to step away from the toxic race of always outdoing themselves and to start focusing on creating something lasting. In many ways, this was the moment they stopped being consumed by the machine of fame and started using it on their own terms. Creatively, the turning point was marked by a project that felt unlike anything they had done before. Where earlier work often carried the bravado of someone trying to prove themselves, this new effort was stripped back, raw, and honest. It wasn't perfect, but it was fearless in a different way. It didn't try to please everyone or chase trends. It told their truth with all the contradictions and scars intact. Critics who had long dismissed them as chaotic or superficial were forced to pause and acknowledge that something had changed. Fans too felt it. They weren't just listening to an artist making music. They were listening to someone who had lived through fire and was finally learning how to speak about it. But perhaps the most defining part of the turning point wasn't in the art itself, but in the way they carried themselves. In interviews, they were no longer defensive or combative. There was a humility in their tone, a willingness to acknowledge mistakes without wallowing in them. When asked about their past scandals, they didn't lash out or deny. They admitted to flaws while refusing to let those flaws define their entire identity. It was a balance that few achieve, taking responsibility while also reclaiming control of their story. That balance resonated deeply, not just with fans but with a wider audience who saw, maybe for the first time, the human being beneath the headlines. The turning point also extended to their personal life. For years, their relationships had been defined by chaos, feuds, betrayals, breakups that played out publicly and added fuel to the fire of their reputation. But during this period, they began repairing bridges that once seemed irreparably broken. Friends and family members who had distanced themselves started to return, cautiously at first, then with more trust as they saw consistency in the artist's action. This rebuilding wasn't dramatic enough to dominate tabloids, but it was profound in shaping the stability they needed to move forward. The people around them noticed the difference, describing them as more grounded, more present, and more aware of the consequences of their choices. Of course, not everyone was convinced. The turning point didn't erase the past, and skeptics remained vocal. Some argued that this shift was temporary, another phase in a long cycle of highs and lows. Others questioned whether the artist could truly sustain the new focus in an industry that thrives on chaos and spectacle. And those doubts weren't entirely unfounded. Fame is a demanding force, one that rewards drama far more than stability. But what made this moment different was the consistency. For once, the artist wasn't swinging wildly between extremes. They were holding steady, even when provoked, even when headlines tried to drag them back into the chaos. That steadiness became its own form of rebellion, proof that growth wasn't just a performance, but a real, ongoing process. The turning point also carried cultural weight. People began re-examining the narrative of their career, questioning whether they had been too quick to dismiss them, too eager to define them by their worst moments. Think pieces emerged about how society handles flawed geniuses, about the pressures placed on young stars, and about the possibility of redemption in a culture that often claims to value second chances but rarely offers them. In this way, the artist's personal transformation sparked broader conversations, further embedding their story into cultural memory. In the months and years that followed, the turning point revealed itself not as a single event, but as a shift in trajectory. Instead of careening from one scandal to the next, the artist began building steadily, slowly, deliberately. The projects that followed may not have matched the commercial highs of their peak, but they carried an authenticity that made them deeply respected. Collaborations with unexpected figures, appearances in unconventional spaces, and ventures outside of music began redefining their identity. They were no longer just a controversial star. They were becoming a cultural figure, someone whose influence stretched beyond the charts. What made this turning point so powerful was its unpredictability. Few had expected them to survive the chaos of earlier years, let alone emerge stronger, more focused, and more self-aware. And yet, by choosing not to run from their past but to learn from it, they carved a new path that was entirely their own. The same unpredictability that once made them volatile now made them fascinating, because no one could say for certain where the story would go next. In the end, the turning point was less about redemption and more about reinvention. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the scandals had never happened. It was about transforming those scars into something meaningful. It was about proving that even in the unforgiving world of fame, change was possible, growth was possible, and survival was its own kind of victory. And while not everyone was willing to embrace the new chapter, enough people did to ensure that the artist's story continued, more compelling than ever. This turning point didn't close the book. it opened a new one. And whether the chapters that followed would lead to triumph or tragedy, one thing was certain: the story was far from over, and the world would keep watching. Because once an artist has captured the world's attention so completely, even their quietest moments become a spectacle, and every choice they make has the power to change everything. Every great story eventually approaches its climax, and for this artist, the so-called final act was not a single explosive moment, but rather the gradual culmination of everything they had lived through: the rise, the chaos, the redemption attempts, the divided public opinion, and the turning point that shifted their trajectory. By the time this act began, there was a sense that the narrative had matured, that the reckless unpredictability of the past had given way to something more deliberate, more reflective, and perhaps even more profound. But in the world of fame, where nothing ever feels entirely secure, the final act was as much about uncertainty as it was about resolution. What defined this stage was a growing awareness of legacy. Unlike the earlier years when success was measured by trophies, record sales, and viral headlines, the artists now seemed to measure their worth by the story they would leave behind. The chaos, the scandals, the constant reinventions, none of it had disappeared, but it was now reframed as part of a larger journey. The narrative shifted from survival to meaning. Fans and critics alike sensed this change, and even those who remained skeptical of the redemption arc couldn't ignore the way the artist carried themselves differently. They weren't trying to outshout the critics anymore. They were letting time, perspective, and honesty do the talking. The final act was also about reconciliation, not just with others but with themselves. In interviews, they began speaking openly about mistakes, regrets, and lessons learned. They didn't try to sanitize the past or paint themselves as a victim of circumstance. Instead, they acknowledged the role they had played in their own downfall. This kind of honesty is rare in the entertainment world, where image control is everything, and it struck a chord with audiences. The same people who once dismissed the artist as chaotic or irredeemable began to see them in a new light, not as perfect but as human. That humanity became central to their final act, transforming them from a spectacle into a symbol of resilience. Creatively, this stage brought some of their most impactful work. Free from the pressure to dominate charts, they created projects that were less concerned with numbers and more concerned with truth. The music was reflective, layered with stories from their journey, blending the pain of the past with the wisdom gained through survival. The lyrics didn't shy away from controversy, they leaned into it, weaving scandals and rumors into art that felt raw and unfiltered. Collaborations also reflected this new direction. Instead of chasing the hottest names for clout, they began working with unexpected voices, rising artists, independent musicians, even figures outside the music world. These collaborations weren't about staying relevant, they were about leaving a mark, creating something meaningful that would outlive fleeting trends. The final act also revealed itself through quieter, more personal choices. While their earlier years had been defined by public battles and constant noise, this stage showed a new preference for privacy. They no longer broadcasted every detail of their life to the world. Instead, they shared selectively, allowing glimpses without feeding the frenzy. This choice confused some fans, who were used to constant spectacle, but it also intrigued others. The mystery surrounding their life became a kind of magnetism, proving that they could hold attention even in silence. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful move is restraint. Public reaction during this act was, as always, divided, but the divide felt softer. Critics who had once dismissed them as a lost cause began to acknowledge the growth. Fans who had stayed loyal felt vindicated, proud that their faith was being rewarded, and those who still doubted, they continued to voice skepticism, but even their criticisms carried less bite, overshadowed by the undeniable fact that the artist had managed to outlast nearly everyone who had once predicted their downfall. Longevity itself became part of the final act, proof that no matter how chaotic the journey, survival in an industry this brutal was its own kind of victory. Perhaps the most striking element of this period was the way the artists began to shape their own myth. They didn't run from the chaos of the past. Instead, they embraced it, weaving it into the larger tapestry of their story, positioned themselves as a cautionary tale, a survivor, and a disruptor all at once. This self-awareness turned their career into something more than entertainment. It became a study in fame, fragility, and resilience. Documentaries, biographies, and think pieces all leaned into this narrative. ensuring that the final act wasn't just written by the media but by the artists themselves. There were still controversies, of course. There always were. Fame doesn't allow for clean endings, and the artists' flaws didn't vanish just because they had matured. But the way they handled these challenges was different. Instead of explosive reactions or public meltdowns, they approached setbacks with a calmness that surprised even their harshest critics. It wasn't about perfection, it was about control, about refusing to let the chaos dictate the narrative anymore. And that shift made all the difference. For the fans, the final act carried a bittersweet tone. They had grown up alongside this artist, lived through the highs and lows, defended them during scandals, and celebrated them during triumphs. Now, watching them reach a stage of reflection and stability felt both rewarding and sobering. It was a reminder that even legends are human, that every story eventually slows down, that no one can live forever in the spotlight's blinding glare. And yet, this act didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a transformation, the closing of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. Industry insiders also took note of how the artist had navigated their final act. In an era where careers often burn out quickly, they had managed to stay relevant for years, not by chasing trends but by refusing to be defined by them. Younger artists looked to their journey as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that fame could destroy, but also that survival was possible if you learned to adapt. This dual legacy of caution and resilience became central to how they were remembered. The most powerful aspect of the final act was its unpredictability. Even in moments of calm, there was always a sense that something could change, that another twist could appear. And that unpredictability kept audiences engaged, kept the story alive. The artist had spent their entire career defying expectations, and even in the final act, they refused to become predictable. That refusal to settle into a neat narrative ensured that their legacy would never be static. It would continue to evolve, debated, and reinterpreted long after the final curtain fell. In the end, the final act wasn't about redemption, or reinvention, or even survival. It was about acceptance. Acceptance of flaws, of contradictions, of the messy truth that had always defined their story. It was about proving that you don't need to erase the chaos to find meaning. You just need to own it. And in owning their story fully, without apology or denial, the artist created something far more lasting than fame. They created a legacy that was real, raw, and impossible to ignore. The final act showed that sometimes the most compelling endings aren't about triumph or tragedy, but about transformation. And for this artist, that transformation was enough to ensure that their name, their story, and their art would echo long after the lights faded, cementing them as one of the most unforgettable figures of their generation. The aftermath of any great story is rarely clean, and for this artist it was no different. When the dust finally began to settle, when the chaos of feuds, scandals, and redemption attempts gave way to quieter days, what remained was a legacy both celebrated and questioned. The aftermath wasn't just about what they had achieved, it was about what their story revealed about fame itself, about the people who had supported them, about the ones who had torn them down, and about the way society consumes and discards its icons. If the earlier chapters of their journey were defined by noise, the aftermath was defined by reflection, a reckoning with everything that had come before. On the surface, the aftermath looked like stability. The artist was no longer in the headlines every other week for controversies or feuds. They weren't fighting to stay visible or pushing themselves into the spotlight with reckless stunts. Instead, their presence became more intentional, more measured. When they appeared, it mattered. When they spoke, it carried weight. The absence of constant chaos created space for people to see them differently, not as a perpetual spectacle, but as someone who had survived one of the most turbulent careers in modern entertainment and still managed to stand. That survival in itself became part of the story. But beneath that stability was a complex truth. The scars of their journey didn't vanish in the aftermath. The controversies of the past continued to shape how they were perceived. For some, the scandals were unforgivable, overshadowing everything they had created. For others, the mistakes were part of what made the story real, a reminder that greatness often comes with flaws. This split meant that even in the calmer aftermath, debates about the artist never stopped. Fans and critics continued to argue online. Documentaries dissected their life, and journalists tried to frame the meaning of their career. In a way, the aftermath proved that their story wasn't just theirs anymore, it belonged to the culture, to the conversations it sparked, and to the people who couldn't stop debating what it all meant. One of the most striking parts of the aftermath was how the artists themselves responded to the legacy they had built. Instead of running from the chaos, they began to embrace it, acknowledging the mistakes, but also insisting that the chaos was part of what had made them who they were. In interviews, they reflected on their lowest moments with surprising honesty, often more candid than fans or critics expected. They spoke about the pressures of fame, the mental toll of being under constant scrutiny, and the regrets that haunted them. But they also spoke about resilience, about the lessons learned from failure, and about the importance of owning your story, even the parts you wish you could erase. This level of self-awareness added new layers to their legacy, making the aftermath not just a time of reflection, but a continuation of their impact. Creatively, the aftermath was marked by projects that felt like a summation of everything they had lived through. The music carried echoes of earlier eras, blending the ambition of their rise with the raw honesty of their later years. There was less urgency to chase hits and more focus on creating work that mattered, work that reflected the scars and the growth. These projects may not have dominated charts the way their earlier releases had, but they resonated deeply with fans who had stuck with them through every twist of the journey. For those fans, the aftermath offered closure, a chance to see their idol not just as a star but as a survivor who had turned pain into art. The aftermath also extended into areas beyond music. The artist began investing in ventures that reflected their growth, mentorship programs for young musicians, charities focused on mental health, and collaborations that aimed to spotlight new voices rather than just amplify their own. These efforts weren't just about image repair, they reflected a genuine desire to give back, to use the platform they had fought so hard to maintain in ways that felt meaningful. For many, this shift was the final proof that the artist had truly evolved, that they were no longer chasing fame but seeking to leave something lasting behind. Of course, the public's divided reaction didn't disappear in the aftermath. Some praised these efforts as noble and authentic, while others dismissed them as performative gestures. But even the skepticism played into the larger truth. People still cared enough to argue. Indifference never set in, and in the world of fame, that is often the clearest sign of a lasting legacy. The aftermath kept the conversation alive, ensuring that the artist remained a cultural figure even when they weren't dominating the spotlight. What made the aftermath so compelling was its unpredictability. Even in quieter times, there was always the possibility of another twist, another revelation, another scandal resurfacing. The unpredictability had defined their career, and it lingered even in this stage. Every public appearance, every new project carried a sense of tension. Would this be another triumph, or would it reignite old controversies? That tension kept audiences watching, kept the fascination alive, and ensured that the aftermath was never truly quiet. The aftermath also highlighted the larger contradictions of fame itself. On one hand, the artist had achieved what so many dream of: influence, survival, and a story that would be remembered. On the other hand, the very path that secured their legacy was riddled with pain, mistakes and sacrifices that left permanent scars. Their story became both an inspiration and a warning, a reminder that fame offers glory but often demands more than anyone realizes. In this sense, the aftermath wasn't just about one individual, it was about the system that created them, consumed them, and then tried to define them. For the fans, the aftermath was emotional. Many had grown up with the artist, defended them during scandals, and celebrated them during comebacks. Now, seeing them step into a more reflective phase felt like watching a friend finally find peace after years of turmoil. The connection between artist and audience deepened, built not just on admiration, but on shared survival. Fans saw their own struggles reflected in the artist's story, making the aftermath a space of collective healing, not just individual redemption. In the end, the aftermath proved that the story of this artist was never going to be simple or neatly tied up. It was too layered, too contradictory, too human for that. The aftermath wasn't an ending, it was a reminder that legacies are living things, shaped not just by the artist but by the people who remember them, debate them, and reinterpret them. For this artist, the aftermath was not about perfection but about persistence, about proving that even after everything, their story still mattered. And in the unforgiving world of fame, that might be the greatest achievement of all. Myths are not built overnight, nor are they crafted solely by the artists themselves. They are born from a mixture of truth, rumor, perception, and the irresistible human need to turn flawed individuals into larger-than-life legends. For this artist, the process of myth-making began long before the aftermath of their career had settled. From their earliest days, whispers of greatness and danger had surrounded them, fueling the narrative that they were more than just a musician. They were a force unpredictable and unforgettable. But it was only in the later years, after the chaos had burned itself out and reflection replaced spectacle, that the myth truly began to crystallize. Cementing the myth wasn't about rewriting history. It was about embracing it, flaws and all, and allowing the contradictions to stand side by side. Every scandal, every feud, every triumph, and every collapse became part of a tapestry too complex to simplify. What once seemed like a series of random, destructive decisions began to look, in hindsight, like the beats of an epic story. The reckless energy of their youth, the spiraling controversies, the desperate attempts at redemption, and the quieter final act, all of it took on new meaning when seen as a whole. Myths are rarely neat or polished. They endure because they reflect the messy extremes of being human, and, in that sense, this artist's life was perfectly suited for myth. The myth grew not just because of what the artist did, but because of what they represented. To some, they embodied rebellion, a refusal to conform, no matter the cost. To others, they symbolized the dangers of fame, a cautionary tale about how quickly success can destroy those unprepared for it. And to many, they were both at once, a figure who lived at the extremes, embodying the beauty and the tragedy of being human under a spotlight too bright to survive unscathed. The fact that interpretations varied so wildly only strengthened the myth. Everyone could project their own meaning onto the story, ensuring that it resonated far beyond the confines of one career. Media played a crucial role in this myth-making. Documentaries began to appear, each framing the artist's journey in slightly different terms, some celebrating them as a genius ahead of their time, others painting them as a product of their own reckless choices. Biographies, both authorized and not, filled shelves with dramatic retellings of their life, complete with interviews from friends, enemies, and industry insiders. These narratives often contradicted one another, but the contradictions only made the story more magnetic. Myths thrive on uncertainty, on the spaces between fact and speculation, and this artist's life offered endless material for both. Fans, too, played their part in cementing the myth. Online communities dedicated to analyzing their lyrics, dissecting their choices, and debating their legacy grew into digital archives of obsession. For some, defending the artist against criticism became almost a moral duty, or for others, critiquing them was part of engaging with the myth itself. Tribute projects, fan-made documentaries, and anniversary celebrations of key albums kept the story alive, ensuring that new generations discovered not just the music, but the legend behind it. Even years after the peak of their career, hashtags bearing their name would trend on anniversaries of scandals, releases, or turning points, proving that the myth had outlived the moment. What made the myth especially compelling was the unpredictability that had defined their life. Even in retrospect, there was always a sense that something else could be revealed, that another hidden layer of the story was waiting to emerge. Rumors of unreleased tracks, secret relationships, and unspoken feuds circulated constantly, keeping the narrative alive long after the artist had stepped back from the spotlight. Each rumor, whether true or not, added to the legend, blurring the line between reality and fiction in ways that made the myth even more durable. Another key part of the myth was the duality of their image. They were both celebrated and condemned, praised as a pioneer while criticized as reckless. That duality mirrored the way myths work in culture. Figures who are too neat, too perfect, rarely endure. What lusts are the contradictions, the stories that force people to argue, to choose sides, to wrestle with what they mean. This artist embodied that tension perfectly. They weren't easy to categorize, and that very difficulty made them timeless. In cementing the myth, the artists themselves became more deliberate. In interviews, they began to speak about their career not just as a personal journey, but as part of a larger narrative. They framed their mistakes as lessons, their scandals as reflections of deeper truths about fame and humanity. Without ever saying it outright, they leaned into the idea that they were more than just a musician. They were a symbol, someone whose story carried meaning beyond the individual. This self-awareness didn't feel arrogant. It felt inevitable, the natural result of living a life so extreme that it demanded interpretation. Philanthropy, too, added layers to the myth. By supporting causes close to their heart, they positioned themselves as someone who had grown beyond selfish ambition. This shift didn't erase the controversies, but it complicated them, creating a portrait of a person who could be both destructive and generous, flawed and noble. Myths thrive on these contradictions, and every new chapter only added to the complexity. The industry's recognition of their influence further cemented the myth. Award shows began giving lifetime achievement honors, not just for the music but for the cultural impact. Younger artists lined up to cite them as inspirations, often framing their own risks and reinventions as possible, only because this artist had broken the ground first. Even those who had once criticized them began to acknowledge that, love them or hate them, they had changed the game. That acknowledgement elevated the story from a personal narrative to a cultural one, ensuring that their myth would live on long after the headlines faded. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the myth was its emotional resonance. For fans, the story wasn't just about watching a celebrity rise and fall. It was about seeing themselves in the chaos, the mistakes, the resilience. People connected not just to the music but to the humanity behind it, to the idea that someone could be brilliant and broken at the same time. This emotional connection ensured that the myth wasn't just about entertainment, it was about identification, about what it means to be human in a world that demands perfection. In the end, cementing the myth wasn't about erasing the past or polishing the story into something neat. It was about leaning into the mess, allowing the contradictions to stand, and embracing the fact that greatness often comes with flaws. The artist's life and career weren't perfect, but myths aren't built on perfection. They're built on impact, on resonance, on the ability to inspire, provoke, and endure. And in that sense, this artist's myth was unshakable. As time moved forward, the myth continued to evolve, reshaped by each new generation that discovered their music and their story. But one thing was clear: the myth was no longer just about the person. It was about the culture that created them, the fans that carried them, and the conversations that refused to let them fade into obscurity. Cementing the myth meant that even when the artist was gone, their story would remain messy, complicated, unforgettable, and larger than life. Every story eventually reaches a moment when the noise fades, and what lingers is the echo, the lasting impression that outlives the chaos of headlines and the intensity of scandals. For this artist, the conclusion is not about tying every loose end or neatly polishing their journey into something easy to digest. It's about recognizing that their story was never meant to be neat. Their life and career were a collision of brilliance and recklessness, of soaring triumphs and devastating collapses, of vulnerability hidden behind a mask of bravado. And perhaps that's why people cannot look away, even because their story doesn't just belong to them, it belongs to anyone who has ever wrestled with ambition, failure, survival, and the haunting need to leave a mark. The conclusion is that the artist's legacy is not just measured by records sold or awards collected, though those are undeniable. It is measured by the way their story forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, about how society builds idols only to tear them down, about how humans are both drawn to and repelled by imperfection. Some will always remember them as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that come with too much power, too much attention, too much pressure too soon. Others will celebrate them as a pioneer, someone who shattered barriers, broke molds, and refused to play by rules written to keep them contained. Both perspectives are true, and both are incomplete, because their legacy, like their life, is layered and contradictory. That contradiction is not a weakness. It is the very thing that cements their place in history. What makes this story resonate long after the headlines have faded is the fact that it is so deeply human. We don't connect to perfection, we connect to struggle. We don't remember the ones who never faltered. We remember the ones who stumbled, fell, and clawed their way back up, even if only partially. In this way, the artist becomes more than a figure in entertainment. They become a mirror reflecting the chaos, the resilience, and the fragility within all of us. The conclusion is not whether they were a hero or a villain, but that they were both, often at the same time, and that duality is what makes their story unforgettable. As the final act gives way to reflection, what remains is the myth, a narrative too powerful to fade, too complicated to simplify, and too resonant to be ignored. People will continue to argue about their place in history, to debate whether they were genius or reckless, to speculate about what could have been if choices had been different. But the fact that these conversations persist is proof of their enduring impact. The conclusion is not an ending, it is a continuation, a reminder that some stories never really close. They evolve, they echo, they inspire, and they haunt. In the end, The artist leaves us with a legacy that is raw, flawed, and magnetic. Their journey reminds us that greatness is not about being flawless, it's about being unforgettable, and no matter where one stands, whether in admiration, disappointment, or somewhere in between, there is no denying that this artist's story has etched itself into culture in a way that ensures it will never be erased. That is the conclusion, the final truth. Their name, their art, and their myth will endure, not because they were perfect, but because they were real.